Welcome to another episode of Mental Health Matters. My name is Tom Duff. I'm the Executive Director of St. Louis Counseling. Check us out at stlouiscounseling.org. If you are curious about looking for a therapist, looking for a counselor, wanting to maybe explore some different topics, check us out. And that is Saint, spelled out, stlouiscounseling.org. And also, if you are wanting to just help out St. Louis Counseling, just share this podcast through social media, download it, ask people to download it as well, subscribe to it. Any way you can help us is helping break down stigma. So exciting stuff. And also, if you are curious about being a sponsor of the podcast, because you feel that you want to get involved and help us break down stigma and make mental health okay talking about around dinner table and just in general conversation, reach out to us, and reach out particularly to Debbie Dugan. That's DDUGAN at ccstl.org. So always, almost every time, sometimes you get me solo when I just want to talk about some stuff, but usually we have intriguing and interesting guests on our podcast to help promote talking about mental health and help educating the public as well as our listeners, of course. And today is no exception. We have on one of our very own counselors, therapist from St. Louis Counseling, and she is Kerri Gallen. Welcome, Kerri.
Thanks, Tom.
All right. This is going to be, I'm just going to set this up. This is going to be a pretty entertaining podcast because when Kerri and I get together, we like to laugh as well, too. And she has a very contagious laugh. We know when she's in the building because we hear some laughter, and then we're just happy. She brings a lot of laughter into our lives in a good way. We're not laughing at you. We're laughing with you, correct?
That's what they all say.
Yeah. You've heard that before, right? So I wanted to have Kerri on the podcast today because a couple different things. One, she's an excellent clinician. So one, if you're looking to, at times get some help, and if she has an opening with her caseload, then by all means, I always recommend Kerri. But she's going to talk to us today about trauma and what that means for people that they're experiencing. Also, just kind of the experience of being a therapist as well. So. But we'll get into a lot of that stuff. But first, Kerri, I always like hearing why people got into the field, right? So you've been in the field a little while now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to date you or anything, but date you in the sense of, telling your age, right? I'm not trying to tell your age. So what got you into the field? See, listen to that laughter, right? But what got you into the field? What made you interested originally?
So I actually started out wanting to be a doctor. When I went to school, I was pre-med for 2 weeks, and then I remembered I don't like blood or science. So I decided that wasn't the best career path, but I knew I wanted to do something people-oriented. And I was a psychology major all along, and as I studied psychology, in particular, it was my serial killers class that pushed me in that direction, because there's a lot of things with serial killers that are common in a lot of people, but there's something in those folks that made them snap. Uh-huh. And I was always curious as we do different things in the classes about if there had been some intervention, could things have been different? And as I started working in therapy and doing different things with clients and working with their families, one of the things that I've always loved is seeing how I don't do the hard work. I really am just there to listen, and but through the time that I have with my clients, they start to see their own strength. And that's the part that I think has always kept me, is being able to be there to help them discover how much potential they have on their own, because they're the ones that are doing the work.
Mm-hmm. So Kerri works in our school partnership program, as well as she's an office-based therapist as well. So she's got, what I'm getting at is you have a wide range of experience. When somebody is looking to find, how would you define a good therapist? Let me ask you that question. What's a good therapist in your viewpoint?
I always tell people finding a therapist is a lot like dating, because you have to jive. You have to have someone that when you meet with them, you connect with them. It's got to be someone who is able to hear and see what you're not saying, but also someone who's not afraid to push you there when you're ready for it. But I also think part of finding a good therapist is also someone who's going to respect boundaries. So if in your first session they're asking you all of your deepest, darkest secrets, to me that's not a good fit because they don't know what you're capable of handling yet. You know, it's like it's got to be someone that helps walk with you on that journey, but is also respectful of, like, at the end of the hour you go home and you need to be able to then get through that next week until you're coming back.
So that's where that clinical integrity comes from in that sense. Now let me back up a minute. Something you said, serial killers class, right? So you had a class in college for
just about serial killers. My favorite class all through college.
Wow. And you're from out east originally, right?
Yes, I grew up in New England, but I went to Truman State University for my undergrad.
Do you still have the accent?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I actually, when I moved to St. Louis, I spent the first 6 months training myself to not have the accent because everybody made such a big deal about it, and everyone would ask me to, like, say different words, which I just found annoying.
Like say Boston.
Well, Boston is one that you can, but if you say it with the accent, it'd be like Boston.
There you go.
But if I'm super tired or if I've been with my family, it's like when I was in New York City a few years ago, after about 3 hours, the accent came back. It's actually kind of embarrassing because then, like, people think that you're making fun of them, but you're not. It just is.
Nice. So one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is trauma, right? So we hear about trauma-informed therapy, trauma-informed communities, trauma-informed. So it's a very common term right now, trauma. And trauma can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So, and also at our agency, you're our trauma-informed your title is trauma-informed coordinator and racial equity coordinator?
Yeah, the more concise way that we put it is that I am the coordinator of trauma-informed and racial equity programs rather than 2 titles.
I thought 2 titles might sound better, but hey, that's all right.
We have so much space at the end of an email.
I was trying to make you more important, but all right.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So for people out there, so sometimes I think, people are going through Facebook and they're swiping through Twitter and all that, and they see these words, trauma-informed, and they may see cognitive behavioral trauma, all these different words, and they don't really know what it totally means, right? So from your perspective, if you wanted to give just a general 101 of what does trauma mean in our world?
So I think when you talk about trauma, research will tell us that 2 out of 3 people in the general population has had at least one trauma. I always assume that it's everybody, because whether it's something that's happened directly to us or to someone that we care about and we love and we know, all of us are impacted. So trauma itself is just like a deeply distressing or disturbing event that we can either witness or we can be part of it. But I think when we talk about trauma-informed care in whatever type of organization you're in, it's using that lens of understanding that sometimes our actions or our words or our responses aren't always driven by us making bad choices. It's about us having this super stressed out brain, and we first need to figure out how do we create safety for folks before we start moving into, ooh, you didn't do this the right way. So it's being very person-centered and figuring out what are ways we can build on their strengths and build on the different factors they have in their lives to create that hope and that resilience and that strength without looking at it from like, oh, when you did this, like I would have done it differently. So it's really taking each person's experience and letting that be the driver.
So when you talk about a trauma event, right? So a lot of times, we know the diagnosis that a lot of people are aware of, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And so a lot of times we associate that right away with war, right? And our veterans and everything. But trauma events, like what are some examples of trauma events?
I think here in St. Louis, one of the things that a lot of us think of when we think trauma, what can come to mind is the events in Ferguson in 2014. But I don't think it even needs to be that drastic. Like, something traumatic could be not being able to make ends meet, or not being able to provide for your family in the way that you want to, getting bullied at school, living in poverty, going through a really nasty divorce. Trauma can be anything because it's all about our perception. So for some of us, we might have an event, like I always like to tell people, we know some people that when they've got everything that could possibly go wrong in their lives and somehow they still get up in the morning and they keep going because they have that natural resilience. And then we all have that friend who like gets a hangnail and they post about it on Facebook for a month, right? Like it's all about how things impact us. So anything could really be traumatic. What changes how it impacts us is the different protective factors that we have in our lives to help us get through whatever it is that's going on.
So I think that's really important to point out, right? Because I think a lot of times people are like, okay, nothing bad really happened to them, right? There was no major accident. No, they weren't a veteran in wartime. They weren't a victim of a specific crime. You know, that's where I think a lot of the general public looks at that. But when you talk about living day in and day out of food insecurity or poverty or things of that nature, and then how they are perceiving and dealing with that. So the outside person, right, doesn't even think about all those other components that a person is living in, and I think we forget that as a community.
Well, and I think a lot of times too, like so at one of my schools, it's in the Greaterville in North City, and there was a student there who hadn't done his homework, and when he was talking to the principal about it, who was fantastic, he said to her, he's like, well, you know, the batteries in my flashlight died because this student and his family had been living with no electricity, right? And like, I always like to use that as an example because it's not something that seems super over the top, but for the parent, you know, like to not be able to have the lights on for your kid. You know, like, and that's the thing when I think we talk about trauma, so much of it is, like, it's not just something that happens to one individual. It's something that happens in a family or something that happens in a community. And I think that's why, like, I get really jazzed that people are talking about it now, because if we want to talk about how do we help make our kids well, we have to look in our communities. And we have to be able to say, okay, like, maybe it's not, like, that was a mom that worked. Like it's not like she wasn't doing her best to make ends meet. She just didn't make enough money. You know, and so like sometimes you have to look at those bigger pictures because I think we become very defensive of our own lives. And, you know, like if I did it this way, then that's how someone should do it. But that's just not the case. You know, like everyone's got different factors and different circumstances. And sometimes if we look at it more from that lens of, okay, let's figure out like what that must be like for you rather than how come you're not doing this instead, I think we can start to move forward because then we're not battling one another.
So for that person out there that, you know, people compare themselves to each other and or they see something in the news that happened to somebody or they know of somebody that's struggling and they just can't do that. And they may be thinking, you know what? I came from a one-parent household. My mom worked all the time, and I turned out okay, right? And so what you're saying is you need to look at, well, what are the other safety factors maybe that person had compared to that person?
Exactly.
Yeah. But so for this person, they may have, mom worked all the time, but they were always at grandparents' house, and they always had electricity. Where you start looking in on a deeper level, you realize these other protective factors. So when you look at safety factors, protective factors, what are some of the common ones that you would look for?
So a lot of times we look at who are the people that you have. So are you part of a community? Do you feel connected? Research shows us that 1 hour a week with a positive relationship can actually start to change what's happening in your brain. So having those connections, having some sort of identity, so whether it's religious identity, cultural identity, family identity, having access to medical care, having those basic needs being met, having job opportunities, having access to food, some of those basic things that we don't even think about can actually be the factors that change the outcome based on what sort of trauma has been happening in somebody's life.
And so, of course, the more you have, the more resilient you could become, and vice versa, of course. So when you are, well, let me ask you this, from a greater sense of the community, understanding what, and I know it's very detailed, right? But if you were trying to build a trauma-informed neighborhood, or maybe even get smaller, a trauma-informed business, trauma-informed school, you know, what are some key components that it would take just to get the conversation going?
I think the first step is just awareness of what it is. That word trauma feels really big. Like I always tell people, you know, like, so I come from a family where like both my parents are cancer survivors. And so that word cancer felt really, really big until I knew all of these people in my family that had survived it. You know, but when people hear cancer, they immediately jump to the worst. And I think when people hear the word trauma, they do the same thing. But trauma is just ongoing stress that we can't get away from. So I think that first step is simply just awareness that this is what it is, and that maybe there's some things happen. We don't always need to know what the thing is that's going on in someone's life, but that understanding that, okay, maybe when my neighbor like does this thing that drives me batty, maybe it's not coming from a place of they're just trying to be like rude. Maybe it's because for them it's really important that all the lawns are clean and manicured because that's how they find order. Or, like just like I think it starts with the understanding. And then from there, I think you start to build in what are some ways that we can connect. So whether it's like, so if you use your example of a neighborhood, like, do we have barbecues? Is there a place that we can all come together? A couple weeks ago on the news, I saw that Better Family Life was starting to do barbecues on street corners in front of churches as a way to address gun violence. And I think it's such a genius idea because let's connect, because when you speak to individuals, nobody wants to be afraid that there's going to be a gun that goes off, but no one knows what the solution is. And so they're saying, well, let's connect. Let's come together because if I know my neighbors, maybe when there's a conflict, we can find another way to work it out. And it seems so basic, but no one's done it.
Yeah.
And so and I think that's the crux of so much of it is like in trauma work, the foundation of everything is relationship. If I don't have, and even just thinking like our lives, right? So you're my boss's boss. If I didn't like you guys, I'll do it, but I'll let you know I don't like something that you asked me to do.
Yeah.
And I will let you know. But I will do whatever's asked and go above and beyond because I feel appreciated, I feel respected, I feel valued because we have a relationship. And I think it's something as basic as that to start looking at how do we build some systems in our neighborhoods. And then once we have those relationships, we can start to tap into what kind of connections or resources do people have. So, hey, you work at this organization. Do they know someone that could maybe come in and do like a pop-up clinic? Or does this organization have some contacts to be able to do like Operation Food Search, how they do the like food, like the meal trucks? And, like connecting to some of those things so we can start to break down the barriers so people can feel supported.
So relationship is key, right?
Absolutely.
And everything, of course, is key, but definitely with getting some of this groundwork started right off the bat. When you see somebody, so okay, you have somebody who's dealing with a trauma from their life, right? And then you have mental illness as well too. And I think a lot of times the two things get confused on some levels.
Absolutely.
And so maybe let's talk a little bit about mental illness and sometimes symptoms that could be mental illness and how they could be really related more to trauma.
So I think, trauma is not necessarily exclusive or excluded from mental illness. You can often have the two hand in hand, and a lot of the symptoms I think can look very similar. So when you think mental illness, a lot of folks will think like depression or anxiety, and you can see some, with trauma, you see some of the withdrawal. You might see that someone feels really anxious all the time, or they're on edge, or they feel like they can't connect or can't get out of bed. And so like sometimes they go hand in hand. But I think it's also important to keep in mind too that mental illness can also be far more extreme. So you may see, so for instance, in like our populations that are in transition, if you don't have access to the medication that you need, say you have schizophrenia, right? Like, and you don't have access to that, people may unfairly start to think that you're dangerous or you're somebody that you can't be around, or they just don't want help when that's not the case. And so that in and of itself, so mental illness can be traumatic. And for any of our listeners who know someone with mental illness, you're impacted by it too. It's so challenging when someone you love can't get out of bed, or and challenging isn't even the right word, but when you've got a loved one who is on the brink of potentially ending their life and you feel helpless, so like I think those things go really hand in hand. And again, I think so much of it starts from understanding. And I think we're moving more in that direction of people are starting to talk about it and starting to say like, hey, it's okay to say like, yes, I struggle with it. And I think you're even seeing a lot of celebrities now that are coming out and saying that they've accessed therapy or they've struggled with mental health, because I think that helps make it normal, because all of us do at some point or another. But there's still so much stigma tied to being able to go seek out the treatment that you need to be able to feel okay being you.
So for somebody that acknowledges they have a trauma, right, in their life, and they want to like try to get some help with it because they understand it's impacting their this level of trauma is impacting their normal life and functioning, and they seek out counseling. Mm-hmm. So what would that look like for a person?
So I think every therapist has their own distinct style, and I think that's an important thing to recognize. So like I always tell my clients, I come from a very sarcastic family. I am pretty quick-witted, so I tend to use humor a lot. So I always start off all of my relationships with my clients telling them that, because if that's something they're not okay with, one, I need to know. And I always tell them too, like, call me out if I go too far. Like that's just, that's how I interact and how I build relationships. And so, and I have had a couple clients over the years that have been like, I don't really like that. Because it's important that you have someone that you feel comfortable with. I think that's at the basis of anything, because if you are going to be processing things that have left such a deep mark on you that like it, it's heavy, and it like I read an article years ago that talked about how there's some things that you don't get over, there are just some things you carry, and our traumas are those things that we carry. So you need to feel safe, and I think that's the first part, is there should always be at least those first couple sessions just creating that safety amongst you and the therapist. From there, my personal preference is that then we start working on building some coping skills for you, because if we're going to be reprocessing what we do, like we can't change what's happened. So I can't take away whatever the event or events have been that have created this trauma, but what I can help you do is when those things come back, I can help you learn how to regulate your body. And if we can regulate your body, you start to own the memory instead of feeling like the memory owns you. So I personally always start with the regulation piece, and I make sure that you've got that down. And so some of it might be us talking about some lower risk things and practicing using those skills while you're processing them, so that way I can see that like it's working. And then from there, we'll start to move into working through some of the things that have happened. I personally believe that you don't even necessarily have to go into the deep detail to heal from your trauma. Some people love to do that. For some people, they might not ever get there, but that doesn't mean that it's a lost cause, because you're still learning those skills, so that way when it comes up, then you're able to still utilize the things that you've learned, so that way you still feel in control. I think a lot of trauma therapy is about helping the client regain their control.
And so, going back to take a look at, different types of trauma and stuff. And so a lot of times we always automatically associate with the worst, but it could be someone that was in a really bad relationship, right? That was just unhealthy, and they're unsure about dating.
Absolutely.
And they are, they have all these issues and anxiety around trying to date again and get comfortable. And that's a reason somebody could come to therapy.
Absolutely.
Exactly. It doesn't mean, you have to be abused or the victim of some situation.
Right. And that's why I say I personally don't think you have to go through all these details of things to heal from it, because it's about creating safety for you. It's about learning how to build in that regulation and setting safe boundaries, whatever that boundary looks like. But then also in your example, learning how to be vulnerable enough to connect. Because I think a lot of us, when we've had hard experiences, our natural response is that we want to hole up. It's not going to get to us. So we're going to put up this wall, but that's no way to live, going through everything on our own and operating as silos. And I don't think as humans, we're designed to do it alone. I think we need connection. And that's where that empathy piece comes in. So finding that safety first with your therapist to be able to do it little by little. And then from there, they'll start to ask you to whether it's just going out for coffee with a friend, or maybe, I don't know. I work with kids, so I'm not going to recommend that they get on Tinder. But
yes,
maybe,
please don't.
Yeah, but maybe that's something you do. Maybe it's finding a way to connect with somebody or going out on a date, even if you don't want a second. But that way you start to build that comfort and being able to push yourself a little bit.
Okay. So as a therapist, so people want to say, does this work? You're coming in and you're talking, and then, you're getting some coping skills, but does it work? What do you say with people like that?
I always tell people that what happens in therapy is magic. It's a beautiful thing to watch happen, because I think it starts with the connection piece. And that's why I say that relationship with your therapist is so key, because if you don't trust them in session, you're not going to trust them enough to do the work outside of session. And every therapist is most likely leaving you with something that they want you to do in between that session and the next one. But as it starts to take hold, and that's where I say it's the client that's doing all of that work, all of a sudden it's things like I say to my clients all the time of like, they always laugh because they're like, you get so excited over like things that no one else would get excited about. But it's even things like feeling comfortable enough to share something. Like, because, like we all know, like I know if I've asked somebody to do something, I know when they haven't. And it's just like when we were kids and it's like, oh, well, how did it go? Oh, it was fine. Oh, I kind of did it. Like, no, you didn't. Just tell me. But you start to see some of those things take hold, and change is slow. You're not going to go to therapy and 3 sessions later walk out and be like, oh, I'm a new person. Like, that's not how it goes. But you start to see little by little that maybe maybe you're someone who feels like you can't connect with your friends and you've got this severe social anxiety. And all of a sudden you find that you answer the phone, or you return a phone call, or, that's huge. Or, for some of my clients that self-harm, they have something that's really overwhelming and they want to, but something keeps them from getting that razor. Like, that's a huge deal. Even if it's just simply that they don't want to share with their loved ones that they've done it, the fact, like, that's a big deal, And so, like, I think when you are sitting in a therapy session, the client's doing a lot of the talking. But I think through that, then they start to see like, okay, here's the potential of what I can have or who I can be, and I want that. And I think that's where like the beauty of therapy happens, because like we can talk to our friends, but there's something about having someone who has no skin in the game, right? Like you can say whatever you need to say, however you want to say it. No one's feelings are going to get hurt. And then all of a sudden you walk out maybe feeling a little bit lighter. And then that light feeling starts to last more than an hour, and then maybe it's a day, and then maybe it's 2 days, and then all of a sudden you find you don't need to come in every week. And I think that's where
it's
you
a good
start.
Description.
Yeah, like I think that's where you start to see like the magic that happens. Like it really is. Like I wish everybody could have the opportunity to like do what we do and get to see it, because it's such a cool experience to get to watch someone find their own hope and discover their own strength and realize, hey, like this was a really cool resource, but I just don't need it anymore. Like that's a really beautiful thing that we get to be a part of.
Yeah, we want people to leave us.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So, you mentioned, I know you're a big proponent of self-care for people doing this work, but also a little bit ago you mentioned, care for the caretaker, right? And so, and of course, being trauma informed, it's important to have that self-care component. So when we talk about let's talk a little bit more about care for the caretakers, right? Because of how hard it is for someone loving somebody, caring about somebody who either has a mental illness or is dealing with a trauma. I mean, what are some steps, they can take, and how do they pull themselves? I think usually the thing of, if I pull away and take care of myself for some things, something bad could happen to that person,
right.
or they're going to think I'm not there for them. But talk about maybe the importance of why that's so vital to be able to do.
Yeah, I think one of the things I always fall back on for anything is the only way out of something is through something, and sometimes that means you just have to let yourself feel it. So I think as a loved one of anyone who's struggling with anything, whether it's a major trauma, whether it's relationship issues, whether it's just someone's been a little crabby for a while, whatever, we've all been there. Like, we want good things for the people that we care about. But I think we have to also remember ourselves in that process. One, we can't carry everybody on our shoulders. And I think some of that's just like a mindset of you just have to be okay with the fact that they have to spread their wings a little bit. And I think that can feel really foreign because we all grow up hearing that we're not supposed to be selfish and you're supposed to take care of people. And yes, and we can take care of ourselves too. And so I think that's part of it. Some of it too then is also like, because I think when we talk about self-care, a lot of times the idea of self-care starts to then put a lot of pressure on them, like, I don't know, like when we talk about self-care, it's like you have to do this or you have to do that, and it can start to feel really overwhelming. So I always like to tell people self-care is a lifestyle, and we have to start before we're in crisis. It's just like anything else, right? Like if I don't fill up my gas tank until I'm sputtering and my car dies, like it's great that I say, ooh, maybe I should put some gas in it, but now I'm stranded on the highway. And so it's the same thing, like we fill it up as we go, because that's what gives us the gas and this metaphor to like get to where we need to be. And so some of it, like it's not just a yoga class. Self-care is making sure, like I am what I consider to be a social introvert. So I know for myself, there are times I need to connect, and then there are times that I need to not, and my friends just know that. And they know, they might ask if I want to do something, and I'll just say no. And that's okay, because I'm 35. See, I can say my age.
Well, see, yeah, there you go.
35 and I'm alive.
Yeah.
But it's okay to say no to things, or it's okay when somebody wants you to cut their grass or to pick up their groceries and you can't, or it's going to be really hard on you. It's all right to say, I can't make that happen today. And if you still want to do something, then, but next week maybe I can build it into my schedule. Or making sure you're finding time to connect with people in a really positive way. So not just connecting about, so like I always say that with the friends of mine that work here, it's really easy for us when we get together to just talk about work, but I feel like that's not healthy. And so making sure you can step away from it. If you're a reader, getting lost in a really good book, or if you're like, I find chopping, I like to cook, so I find chopping things.
Back to that serial killer thing.
It is the serial killer thing. Not my weapon of choice.
Yeah, just making sure.
But it's really cathartic, right? Like, or like cleaning, or like whatever that thing is, and it's different for all of us. Like I always tell people, I'm never going to be a runner. I'm just not. I'm not going to be the kind of person who, when I'm stressed, is going to go run a few miles. Like, I might want a couple cheeseburgers, but but like you have to find the things that work for you and make sure that everything's happening in moderation, but that it's woven in and out everything you do throughout the day. So you should have a plan of like, if I get really overwhelmed at work, what can I do if I need to step away for a couple minutes? Or if I am driving on the road and I am stuck in traffic, which is like my biggest pet peeve, like what am I going to do to keep myself in check so I don't want to like bump the guy in front of me?
Being proactive.
Exactly.
Planning.
Exactly. Or like, so that way I don't end up taking it out on like kids when I get home, or I don't have any, but for those of you who do.
Yeah.
I'll take it out on that zucchini. but for those of you who do, like, how do you make sure that like you can leave work at work?
Yeah.
And setting some of those boundaries for yourself. And if you're in an environment where your supervisors and your bosses are not creating that, then you have to create that for yourself. There are times that we're going to work too much. Like we all have that. Like there are certain times of the year for everyone that it's busy, but then those times that it's not, like when you go home at whatever time you're off, be done.
Yeah, and let it go.
Yeah.
Well, I do like what you said, the one phrase, self-care is a lifestyle, and work nowadays, I mean, it used to always be back in the day, right? Before either of us were born, it was all like you put your 40 hours in and that was it. And then you had your barbecue and you had your family events and all that. And now that 40 hours for most of us, and I mean, I don't know what the research is. I've seen it, but it's like so many people work 50 or more hours a week. Work is constant. So if you don't make that part of your lifestyle and schedule that, then boom, what happens.
It's easy because we can all, not all of us, but most of us can work somewhat remotely now. Like I always say, the internet has done nothing except extend the workday.
Yeah.
And so like that's why we have to put that in for ourselves, because I think it's easy to think, if I don't do this, who will? Or feel like you're this like super vital cog in the wheel, which we all play a role and we're all important. But if we stole from whatever company we're working in, you wouldn't be so important that they don't fire you, right? So like, if that's the mindset, like we have to use that for ourselves too, of like, it's okay if you've got something going on with your family to not check your email that night, or to know that like whatever comes through, I don't like. I'll check my email once or twice over the weekend simply because of what I do. But
I know you never answer.
I don't respond
all these work things are going on.
I don't respond until Monday because I'm not at work. And that's my way to make sure that there isn't something that I need to be ready for on Monday. But when I'm done, I'm done.
Yep, boundaries, which is important for all of us. And it is. I mean, the phones make us like Pavlov dogs almost, because it dings or it vibrates, and people, I mean, I'm guilty of it. You just, boom, you look, boom,
Or
you
do you
look.
see, so Tom has an Android. You guys can't see this. I have an iPhone, and it tells me how many times I pick mine up during the day, and it's alarming.
That's just wrong. What is that about?
And to be fair, my watch broke, so sometimes I pick it up to see the time.
But yeah. Wow, I didn't know that. See, that's weird. I wouldn't want that.
But I like it, though, because it reminds me not to.
I guess that's good.
You know, because like I think in a way it's like a good reminder of like, we don't really like. Like the other day it said I picked it up over 300 times.
Well, you got a problem.
Well, I don't have a watch.
You check the time 300 times?
I'm sure you guys have done it where like you pick your phone up and then you put it down and you're like, I didn't even do the thing I wanted to do.
Yeah. I just read this article.
Yeah, but you know, like, I mean, it's so easy for us to do stuff all the time because we're connected all the time, but being connected all the time isn't always a good thing.
No, not for our brains
right.
either. So, jumping back into helping people, right? So, how do you help when we look at somebody, a person who's, has a trauma or a mental illness, and the caretaker is trying to take care of them, but then there's kids involved too, and you've worked with a lot of kids over time. So how does that caretaker also provide support to the kids as they're trying to help the other parent or individual through their own, take care of them as well too?
I think it's important to provide developmentally appropriate answers for kids, because I know from the families I've worked with, I know I hear it from my friends with their kids, like everyone thinks that kids don't know. And they do. They know I love to tell the story when I do different trauma trainings. My dad worked in retail. And when I was little, at one point, he had been laid off. And we used to go to this diner in the town I grew up in called Nick's for breakfast. And I'd always order chocolate chip pancakes. And I'm like,
shout out to Nick's.
I'm like 8. Yeah. Nick's in Madison, Connecticut, if you're still there. But we go one time, and my dad had lost his job, and I ordered regular. And he's like, well, Kerri, why don't you want chocolate chips? And I looked at him dead serious. I said, can we afford this? And he's like, yeah, I got it. It's like 50 cents.
Yeah.
And I'm like 9. I have no idea. But like kids
always looking out, weren't you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, kids pick up on stuff, whether or not we tell them what's going on. And I find more often than not, kids are relieved when they start to get answers, because if they're not getting it from you, they're getting it somewhere. And in today's world of internet, they're going to Google, so-and-so is showing all of these different things. What does that mean? And you don't want your kid Googling stuff, because whenever you Google any it's like when you go to the doctor, right? Like, you're always dying.
Yeah, exactly. You get the worst symptoms.
Yeah, and it's really like a cold.
Yeah.
I think it's the same kind of thing. So give them developmentally appropriate answers for why whatever caregiver is acting or responding in a certain way. You don't have to go into the nitty-gritty with them, but, let them know. Like, say it's depression. Like, mommy or daddy just feels really, really sad sometimes. And sometimes that means that they can't answer when you call. But it doesn't mean they don't love you, and so that way you help let them know it's not their fault. But then I think it's also important to set some boundaries to make sure you're not allowing your children to become the caretaker either. And I think that's where it can get wonky, because you want to take care of the people you love, but kids also need to be able to be kids. And so that's where I think providing some of that normalcy as well, of like, if they go to the playground every Saturday, find a way for them to still be able to get there. Let them have play dates, even if it means you can't have them at your house. Find a way for them to be able to do those things, so they don't start to assume that role. And I think it's important that we model coping skills for kids too. So like I always tell the parents I work with, it's okay. Like, say you're going through a divorce and it's really hard and it's really sad. It's okay for them to see you sad within limits, right? Like, if you walk around sobbing all the time, that's probably not good. But it's okay to say to them, like, yeah, I am really sad about this. But you know what, mommy and daddy, like, we love you so much. And when I feel really sad, here's something I do that can help me feel better. What do you think you could do? That way they can start to build some of those systems for themselves.
So some structure and routine, maintaining that, and then education.
Right.
Yeah. And it's important, I totally agree with. You don't want them going to the internet. Well, and then that creates so much more anxiety inside of them on what could potentially oh my gosh, my dad is dying, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, or they read things about how, and no one really knows what they think they know about mental health. I think mental health is so different from person to person, and then like they'll read things about how it's hereditary, and then they're like, oh, like I can't tell you how many kids I have come in with printed articles from like WebMD, and they've circled all the symptoms, and I'm like,
yeah, I want to be this. Hello, yeah.
I went to school. Like, I'll let you know if this is what we're dealing with. Like because I think, especially, I remember learning that even in college. Not just in my serial killers class, but in all of those.
You took some other classes.
I did have more than one. Yeah.
Okay.
But they will, like they'd always say, like, you look at the symptoms of anything mental health related, and you start to think you have it all. And so you have to really look at how much is this impacting your functioning, and if it's not, then there might be times that all of us might feel depressed, or there may be times that we feel anxious, but is it pervasive, and is it something we're dealing with all the time? And that's where you need to really rely on the professional to diagnose you and not WebMD.
The ebb and flow of mental health.
Right.
Wow, we have covered a lot. That's the beauty of talking to Kerri, because she will start talking, but there's so much that she shares that is just enlightening on a lot of levels. And, definitely we can hear the passion in your voice as well, too. And I think that's so important when you are looking to get help from somebody, as you find somebody, of course, knowledgeable, and you have that fit, but they have a passion to help. And so I always commend you on that.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
Every once in a while, I can be serious with you, I guess. But
every once in a while.
Yeah, every once in a while. So, we've been here on Mental Health Matters talking to Kerri Gallen with St. Louis Counseling. We've covered so many things from serial killers to mental illness to, trauma, which all kind of connect in a weird way. That's usually the way it is when we talk. But I guess I want to kind of start closing up here. When we talk about trauma, and what would be your plea, so to speak, for communities, neighborhoods, businesses, churches, organizations to consider exploring this topic?
I think more than anything, I would say let's talk about it. Because I think trauma is so private. So I think I was telling you earlier, I've been watching Mad Men, which I'm like obsessed with. Everybody watch it. And
local celebrity John Hamm.
Yes, John Hamm. Hashtag I love you. But
we will tag him in that. Yes.
I'll send you my phone number. But Don Draper, who's the character he plays, has so much trauma, and he just covers it all up, right? Like, and you see it throughout the show. And I think that, to me, like, he wants to put on this air of everything's okay. When you can see that he's not, and he's hurting, and he's reeling from all these things that have happened. And I think when you look at our communities, it's the same thing. Like, I think we're all afraid that we're going to be scrutinized in an unpleasant way, so we don't want to talk about it. We'd just rather all walk around and be sick. And so I think that, to me, more than anything, like, that would be the starting plea. And then I would say to use empathy as the driver for everything that we do. Like, I think if we can put ourselves, even if it's not putting ourselves in the shoes of someone, but try to understand where they're coming from and why decisions are being made, or what are some systems that are in place that, I always say you can't talk about trauma without talking about race, for instance. And in St. Louis, that could be a whole other podcast.
Yeah. But round two.
I'll be back. John Hamm, you can be here too. I think in St. Louis in particular, there's so much judgment on all these sides without trying to take time to listen and understand. And I think if we took a little bit of time to try to understand where people are and what life is, and how to live in the life that different people in various facets have, I think that would also help us figure out how do we then come together to try to figure out what's going to work. So I think that would be it, is to just use that empathy and take that time to, like, be a partner and, and be a companion, and to figure out where people are coming from before we just start to, like, create policies and try to come up with all this stuff without any rhyme or reason as to how it impacts the people that are involved.
Awesome. Great advice. And, if you want to get a little glimpse of what trauma is, tune into Mad Men, stream it, right? I'm glad we keep mentioning John Hamm's name. I mean, we'll keep tagging him, and maybe he'll like our tweet or something. But anyway, Kerri, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your knowledge. Love the fact that what you're talking about is connection and empathy. And one other thing, if you're out there listening and you're like, I want to do something, I want to help. One of the things you said is at least an hour a week with somebody significant in your life. Go out and volunteer. Be a big brother, big sister, other mentoring programs that are out there. That can really shape a person's life. Research shows it as well too. And if you want to reach Kerri, if you have any questions for her, you can find her on our website, stlouiscounseling.org. Spell out stlouiscounseling.org. Until next time, this is Tom Duff. Kerri Gallen, thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
And we will see you later.
This has been Mental Health Matters with Tom Duff of St. Louis Counseling Services. Check out stlouiscounseling.org for more information.